The first half of Terrence Malick's film The New World is devoted to the relationship between English Captain John Smith and Indian Princess Pocahontas, the daughter of Powhatan, the Indian chieftain of the Powhatan Confederacy. This PowerPoint briefly goes through the evidence for and against such a relationship. We'll begin with John Smith. John Smith was born in 1580. He lived in England. According to his own autobiography, he went to sea at age 16, traveled throughout the Mediterranean, was captured by the Turks, enslaved, and finally escaped his enslavement, made his way across Europe back to England by 1604. All this before he ever stepped foot in Virginia or Jamestown. John Smith was working with the Virginia Company of London by 1606. He traveled with the company and its 105 settlers to Jamestown in 1606, 1607, although Terrence Malick's film correctly demonstrates that John Smith was locked up below board by Captain Christopher Newport on the voyage. Despite this, once he got to Jamestown, John Smith proved to be one of the best leaders in the Virginia settlement. 1608, he traveled throughout the colony and mapped it. And later, in September of 1608, he became the president of the local council and enforced strict discipline to ensure that someone in the colony survived. The next year, in 1609, and returned to England. Okay, now let's look at the relationship between Pocahontas and John Smith. According to the traditional story told by John Smith himself in 1624, he was traveling through Virginia in December of 1607, seeking food along the Chickahominy River, north of Jamestown. He was captured by Opechanaqua, the brother of Powhatan, taken to the headquarters of the Powhatan Confederacy, and was going to be killed by Powhatan and the leaders of the Confederacy. At the last moment, according to Smith, Pocahontas intervened and, at the minute of my execution, she hazarded the beating out of her own brains to save mine. And not only that, but so prevailed with her father that I was safely conducted to Jamestown. This story has become popular. It's not only portrayed in Terrence Malick's film, it's also in the Disney version of Pocahontas and in all kinds of forms of popular Western art. Now, what are the problems with the Pocahontas story? The first problem, and the most obvious problem, is that it does not appear in the three early versions John Smith wrote of his time in Virginia. Now, the second problem with the story is that John Smith initially wrote this story of Pocahontas saving his life in 1624 in his general history of Virginia, New England, and the Summer Isles. You may say, why is this a problem? Well, it's a problem because this is published after Pocahontas had married John Rolfe. She traveled to England and she became what you might call an American idol, an international celebrity. Shortly after her visit with the king and queen, Pocahontas died of either pneumonia or tuberculosis, and it's after that that John Smith incorporates her into his own story. That is, he uses her celebrity to leverage his own celebrity, one might say. Now, there's no sure evidence that this is true, but it seems unlikely that such a story would be omitted from the first three versions and then added later. One has to call this into question. Now, John Smith claimed to have written about the Pocahontas story in 1616 in a letter to Queen Anne, but the original letter has never been found, and its first mention is found only in John Smith's General History of 1624. A third problem with the Pocahontas story is that Smith was a notorious braggart, quite different from the character portrayed in Terrence Malick's film. He wanted to be a celebrity. He wanted to talk about how great he was, and so it seems highly likely that he may have preyed upon the celebrity of Pocahontas to increase his own celebrity. This certainly was not unusual in the era, In fact, it was common for people to adopt the stories of other famous celebrities at the time and include them in their own story. One such example would include the story of the Spanish explorer Juan Ortiz, who was captured by Indians in 1528 and was going to be executed, and yet an Indian maiden named Eulalie intervened, saved his life, and this story was published in England in 1605 on the eve of John Smith's voyage to England. So he may have, again, incorporated this into his own narrative. A final issue with the Pocahontas story that we might think of is the fact that John Smith's engraver, the individual who illustrated his general history, certainly used other images to illustrate John Smith's story. The most famous example involves the story of John White. John White was an English explorer who went to Roanoke Island in the 1580s and did a series of beautiful watercolors, and John Smith's engraver used one of those, changing the narrative completely. So if we look here at this image illustrating John Smith's general history, we see on the left Smith's image, which includes John Smith captured by two Indians in the central image, and it says, "Their triumph about him." On the right, we see John White's initial watercolor, which was a fertility festival dance. And you see here that the gourds and musical instruments have been replaced by bows and arrows and a savage dance. Finally, the significance of the Pocahontas story and last questions. Well, the significance of the Pocahontas story to me is clear. People like it because it is a love story. People like it because it seems to draw in the Indian perspective from the Powhatan. People like it because Pocahontas is a strong female character. But all of these have to be taken into question. Pocahontas, we know, was between 10 and 15 when John Smith arrived in Virginia in 1607. He was at least 27 or 28, so this seems unlikely that there was any love relationship between the two individuals, and yet Terrence Malick has devoted half of his film to this very relationship. This seems quite odd. So here in the last image we have a depiction from the Jamestown Exposition of 1907 that occurred in Norfolk, Virginia, and here you have a John Smith character shaking hand with an Indian, and in the background the sun is rising, and we have that great English ship on the horizon, all foretelling a fortuitous future. And yet what actually happened was so much different, as Edmund Morgan portrays it in his essay The Jamestown Fiasco. This was a brutal exploratory mission in which Indians were wiped out, removed, and the English transplanted their own society. Quite distinct from what we see in these two images of Pocahontas, John Smith, and the Powhatan people.